The title of today, as you might recall, is Crisis and Conciliation and Contempt for Europe. And it would be fair to say that in much of the discussion about crisis in Europe in the last few years, particularly related to the European Union, there has been mention of Greece. But it's also fair to say that much of the debate and the perspectives that we have on crisis in Europe and on the issues in Europe comes to us through the Fleet Street media. It's very rare that we have the opportunity to actually hear directly from a representative of Greece, of the Greek government, of their perspective on the recent events and the implications of those events for governments and for the people of European Union countries. So it's with very great pleasure now that I welcome to speak to us the Ambassador of Greece to Australia, His Excellency Haris Dafaranos. His Excellency is a career diplomat for the Greek government. He's been in the diplomatic service since 1980 and has served in quite a number of countries in different parts of the world. So he has had great opportunity to understand how Greece is seen in different parts of the world and to represent the interests of Greece. You would know, Ambassador, that Australia has many people within it who are very affectionate towards Greece, and so you come to speak to an audience where we know firsthand from friends and colleagues something of the Greek experience. But it's terrific to have you here today and to hear your perspective as Ambassador of Australia on European Union. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Should I say also, welcome to the new Consul General of Greece to Melbourne. We're delighted to join you with us as well also.
Thank you. Professor Wilson, dear Ben, ladies and gentlemen, Happy New Year. May I give you also my best regards on the occasion of the upcoming Australia thing. For a Greek diplomat, it is extremely important to be in London. I acknowledge the presence of our Consul General of Greece, as well as Mr. Kaliniou, an editor of the National Newspaper. Melbourne is very dear to me, not only because it is a mega city which inspires, it is also a city which hosts a large number of Greek Australians. And being in Australia, affiliated by definition country, is something we must cherish very much. The purpose of being here is, as you know, to speak about the Greek economic crisis. And to tell you the truth, it is the first time that I had the opportunity to speak about it in a comprehensive way. And I have to admit that I tried to distance myself as much as possible from the subject, trying not to see it, in a sentimental way. Thank you. I tried to see it in a sentimental way, and I wanted to use the opportunity to show you, as people who are interested in European affairs or European experiences, to try to see certain things which may maybe go out of the ordinary, may touch a nation, and sometimes have a social. You think it's better? Thank you very much.
Can you hear them? They're not.
Is it better?
Yes.
I apologize. So, I wanted to give the opportunity to an audience to see what crisis and progress, which is the subject of your first day of this seminar, mean for Europe, especially for a country. And if somebody tries to see that the European integration has been a series of successes, but through crises. Even one of the founding fathers, Jean Monnet, says that union integration is achieved through crisis. L'union s'achève parmi les crises is one of his sayings. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be among you at the Immigration Museum on the first day of this summer school, focusing on crisis and progress. My appreciation and thanks to Monash European and EU Studies Center and Professor Mrs. Pascaline Vinon, as well as to Dr. Ben Wellings, lecturer in European Studies, who had the kindness to invite me for this lecture. The subject of my intervention is the Greek economic crisis. I intend to speak about the causes that brought this pathology, the response and the remedies, the impact on the Greek society, the current situation and the way forward. I will touch always both on the national and the European international dimension. First of all, allow me a small parenthesis on the term crisis. As you most probably know, crisis is a Greek word. It means judgment, from the verb krino, that is, I judge, I evaluate in order to pass a judgment. So by historic irony, this crisis, the Greek crisis, has become an historic milestone for modern Greece in a long process of multifaceted change which has just begun. As you know, the Greek sovereign debt crisis, as it is called, is only one part of the wider problem of economic stability and performance facing the European Union today. Now, let's try to speak about the causes that brought this crisis. And in this effort, we can find certain parameters. First, Greece entered the Eurozone in the year 2001. And according to many analysts, she did not meet at that time the two prerequisites, what we call convergence criteria. That means a country had to have no more than 3% of her GDP. You know what is GDP, what a country produces. So the government deficit had to be no more than 3% of the GDP. And the second criterion was national debt. A country should not have more national debt than 60% of her GDP. So these were the two requirements. So Greece was not the only member state who had deficit higher than 3.1% of GDP, but the problem was that since 1993, Greek public debt had fluctuated around the equivalent of 100% of GDP. So this is something I want you to have in mind. Second parameter, Greece, the European Union at that time, had a certain fiscal discipline enshrined in the Stability and Growth Pact. The Stability and Growth Pact safeguarded that countries which belonged to the Eurozone had these two safeguards, these two benchmarks. Unfortunately, in November 2003, a number of member states called for the suspension of a procedure to correct excessive deficits. The countries were France and Germany, by historic irony. The European Commission took the case to the European Court of Justice, and the verdict was in support of governments. So what we see is that in the beginnings of the Eurozone, the Stability and Growth Pact finally was not implemented. So there was a kind of tolerance, laxity. History will judge. Third parameter, the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis knocks on the doors of Europe in 2008. By knocking on the doors of Europe, this global financial crisis exposed many Greek vulnerabilities: a non-competitive economy, a weak administration, a tax evading mentality, over-borrowing and overspending. And I would like you to highlight these two words, over-borrowing and overspending. Fourth parameter. Greece for years had inherited economic weaknesses. These weaknesses have been exacerbated with our participation in the Eurozone for one very small and simple reason. We had the opportunity to have access to low interest rates. So, the Greek main weaknesses were lack of competitiveness, account deficits, very significant, and in general, we must confess that we were a country where growth depended on consumption based on borrowed money. Now, what was the result of these things? The Stability and Growth Pact, as I told you, aimed to ensure budget discipline. But unfortunately, the lenient application of these convergent criteria allowed Greece to join the Eurozone, but this, in the long run, undermined the Stability and Growth Pact and weakened economic stability. A number of analysts believe that Greece embellished her public debts and budget deficit. The EU did not ensure accountability in those numbers, so Greece received all the benefits of a single currency that she would have been denied otherwise. What happened as a result of easy lending? My country was consequently allowed to accumulate enormous debt due to the low interest rates afforded by the Eurozone membership. So what happened? As you can imagine, Greek households used the credit in order to purchase exports from the major industrial European partners. It goes without saying that those industrialized partners' competitiveness increased significantly. It was a situation which was tolerated. The new ability to borrow and lend led to an increase in private investment, and Greece had annual growth rates of 3.9% over the period 2001-2002. A period of euphoria, unfortunately, ensued. The low interest rate environment led to further borrowing and increased consumption. Everybody was happy, but the situation was not good. During the same period, competitiveness declined by 20 to 25% because wages appreciated by 10%. A non-sustainable standard of living was based, unfortunately, on extensive borrowing. A political system operating on a trade-off of votes for jobs for many years had almost damaged the competitiveness of the Greek economy. So, the deficit from 7% in 2001 reached 14.5% in 2008, when the global financial crisis occurred, and the external debt from 94% in 2003 reached the height of 200% at the end of 2010. Allow me a small parenthesis. Sometimes we speak about embellished data on public debt and budget deficit. You know that there are what we call creative accounting methods, which sometimes are used by all the countries within the international society. Sometimes countries use these methods with the help of balance sheet cosmetics. That means military expenditures or expenditures on health can be left out for a certain period of time between the time of ordering an equipment and the time of receipt. This was a practice used by many other member states' governments. And this was an effort to improve their balance sheets during the corresponding term of office. I don't want to speak about other kind, of lending practices. The question is that what happened in October 2009, the Greek budget deficit, which was at first estimated to be 6 to 8% of the national GDP, was revised to have reached the proportions of 12 to 13% of the GDP. This was the climax. It was a very difficult period because in December 2009, the rating agency Fitch downgraded Greece from A- to BBB+. It was the first time that Greece in 10 years was rated below A. And then, with a very big speculative attack internationally, between October 2009 and July 2011, Greece will be downgraded 6 times. By Standard & Poor's, by 6 times by Moody's, and 7 times by Fitch. What happened? By the spring of 2010, Greece became effectively shut out of the financial markets, where she had to borrow. And she faced an unprecedented speculative attack. Imagine that 6 months ago, 6 months before, Greece could borrow at rates identical to Germany. One may wonder, was this the inevitable consequence of imposing a single currency on a very heterogeneous group of countries? It was a Greek crisis, but it was also a systemic European crisis. And please, I would like you to remember this. The high rates charged for borrowing reflected the reaction of the financial markets to the Greek over-borrowing, as I explained to you, which had been the practice of so many years. Fiscal profligacy, driven by the expenditure of an elaborate welfare state and rising public sector wages, was not sustainable anymore. So, what would be the cure? One cure was default, the other cure would be assistance. Fiscal consolidation became the #1 priority, and the big problem for Europe was the risk of contagion, especially for the Eurozone. In May 2010, Greece committed herself to a very severe austerity program in exchange for a 3-year financial assistance. The total was 110 billion euros, 80 billion in the form of voluntary loans from participating Eurozone members and 30 billion from the IMF. Greece was supposed to bring her deficit down to healthy numbers, 3% of GDP, by the year 2014. There were detailed quarterly targets, and there was the Troika, which is the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, who would monitor the implementation. So, the purpose of this package was to give some breath to Greece, to fill the funding gap for the period during which she had to make all the necessary reform and be able to go back in a healthy way to financial markets. This was expected to be end 2012. Now you will ask me, did Greece have the opportunity not to accept such a package? Many analysts argue that Greece would certainly have defaulted on her debt if she had not been bailed out. But we have to think about two more dimensions. A sovereign default would have devastated the Greek banking and financial sectors, and it would have been almost impossible for the Greek government to recapitalize on its own the Greek banks. Secondly, in the case of a default, also a fiscal adjustment would have been inevitable. So for Greece it was an impasse, either take it or leave it. If you ask me what was the exposure of other Eurozone member states to Greece debt, I can say that it was not enormous. Let's say in June 2010, Greece owed to Germany 31 billion euros and to France 57 billion euros, private and public debt. But what prevailed as a consideration for this package was the high probability of contagion in case of a Greek default. What would be the impact on Portugal, Ireland, and Spain? And such a contagion would have been far more costlier because it would have necessitated bank bailouts. So at the critical moment, we have to admit that the need for stability, for economic stability, was important. And I have to confess that it's extremely important that a form of European solidarity was there. It was not for free, but it was there, and it was at far better rates. If you had to borrow in the international market at 10%, the European solidarity was at 5%. So Greece was in a very weak position, and it was inevitable that she became obliged to accept harsh conditions for the bailout. Later on, as it was revealed, this first bailout deal of the year 2010 of 110 billion euros went off course to the extent that it evangelized growth of 1.1% of GDP in the year 2012. Instead, Greece had a recession of 6.4%. Unemployment was forecasted to reach 14.8% in 2012. We got instead 24%. So the considerable optimism of 2010 started evaporating in the first months of 2011. And the Eurostat, that means the European Statistics Agency, published a revised estimate of the 2009 Greek deficit, and this time it was 2 points higher, 16% of GDP, than previously assessed. So this development, combined with the failure of the markets to respond positively to Greece's implementation of the austerity program, brought a second bailout. The European Council of March 2011 set up a long-term mechanism, a permanent firewall as it is called, the European Stability Mechanism. And this record bailout agreement on Greece was an additional package of economic assistance of 130 billion euros, as well as a private sector initiative component, which enabled a 50% haircut on Greek bonds held by private investors. Greece accepted once again. Many analysts believe that if she had not accepted it, default would have led to the same if bigger amount of economic and political catastrophe. Many also believe that it was a right choice in the sense that there can be some chance of change of attitude from the main players involved that could in the future lead to more lenient terms of rescue for the country. It was to be a draconian plan of massive fiscal adjustment under the assumption that Greece can return to private capital markets by the year 2015. My foreign minister mentioned recently the monetary union was from the beginning a voluntary effort, organized to function economically under normal circumstances. It did not make any provision for the eventuality of a crisis, like the one the global economy faced from 2007 onwards. This is a big word. The Greek adaptation program, which includes fiscal as well as structural adjustments, was a model that we did not choose, but it was the only solution that would avert a disorderly default. I think that this is a statement. Greece was obliged to perform in terms of fiscal discipline. That means she had to lower gradually, to reduce gradually her deficits, which had mushroomed through the years. She was also forced to bring the necessary structural changes. As you can imagine, the burden and the challenge were obvious. Since 2010, a society underwent a fast and harsh fiscal adjustment, which brought necessary changes, but let me highlight unprecedented recession and extremely high unemployment. The Greek economy shrank by more than 20%. Unemployment reached 27%. 31% of Greeks are at the risk of poverty or social exclusion. There is no doubt that certain measures were long due to reduce the bureaucracy, to make the public sector smaller and efficient, to liberalize certain professions, and of course, to put some austerity in public expenditure. Wages faced a drastic cut of around 22% in order to be able to regain at least 2/3 of lost competitiveness. In terms of statistics, things are very good. The budget deficit reduced from 14.9% in 2008, in late 2012 reached 3.4%. Very good statistics. And it is extremely interesting that at the end of 2013, even a primary structural surplus of 816 million was achieved. There has been an unprecedented increase in taxes, and undoubtedly significant improvement in tax collections. The pension system was restructured, no symptoms of bogus pensions, but the cuts regarding pensions and superannuation reached almost 40%. Reduced public spending has had severe consequences on health and education. And as I said before, unemployment has skyrocketed to 27.1% and 59% for the youth. This was very strong. If you try to see how is the situation today, I will just quote the rating agency Moody's, which says in a very eloquent way 3-4 small priorities. A lot of good work, despite low growth and political uncertainty. 6 years of recession, but now the Greek economy is bottoming out. A contraction of 0.5% is expected in 2014 and growth of 1% in 2015. Net exports are going to be the growth driver of the economy, with tourism on top. Private investments, fragile and weak. A lower likelihood of exit from the euro area as a result of a slowing, improving economy. GDP per capita, $24,260. So we're not talking about a poor country. We're talking about a country which has a highly educated working class, a very interesting academia, very good professionals, and a country which has institutions and infrastructure, but a country which was obliged to put in reverse her growth and lose something which no other country in the international community has lost, as I said, at least 20% after the Second World War. Many Greek analysts speak about the fact that Greece is reaching an open humanitarian crisis despite the healthy statistical performance acknowledged. With a 20 to 25% GDP contraction, 27% unemployment, 59% youth unemployment, increasing brain drain, the emergence of a no-future young generation, and a 22 to 40% wage/pension reduction, Greece, no doubt, is facing an unprecedented hemorrhage. The obligation to privatize state assets must not become a sellout of vital public resources. The absence of emergency assistance for growth and the draconian observance of the rules by the creditors seem to paint the future with difficult colors. The internal devaluation, because this is what has happened. You know that if you are almost bankrupt, you have the opportunity to use as a tool the devaluation of your national currency. Being in the Eurozone area, the only remedy you have is you have to devaluate internally wages and pensions. This is what happened with Greece. So, the internal devaluation, which has been implemented, has made living conditions very difficult and unsustainable for a healthy business environment. The banking system, although was recapitalized, does not have still the ability to inject any liquidity to the market, and there is a draining of resources from the average citizen by the intense austerity which deprives the economy of minimal subsistence flow of money. Just to give you an example, the deposit base, that means all the deposits of the Greek citizens, has an unprecedented erosion estimated at 70 billion euros. People, though, have shown an heroic resilience. They have paid at least 70 billion euros in fiscal measures during the last 4 years, and their disposal income has been reduced by almost 40%. So for me, and this is the purpose of my talk, I have to speak and clear certain stereotypes. First, there is no doubt that Greece bears, of course, a certain responsibility. As I said before, failings in governance accumulated through the years, a soft target for the GFC, and please let me highlight a very important sentence. Greece sparked the Eurozone crisis, but was not its primary cause. Where lies the cause? The cause lies in the fact that the Eurozone was at that time an incomplete economic and fiscal union of member states with different structures, including advanced industrial countries and less mature economies of the European South. Different levels of development between the North and the South of Europe brought large and increasing account deficits, a loss of competitiveness as well, in the case of Greece and other states on the periphery of the Eurozone. Second item, the Euro area participation encouraged uncontrolled borrowing and worsened the Greek condition at the time of the global economic crisis. This is a fact. Third, there are certain stereotypes. I'm sure that you have come across them. Greek statistics, laziness, tax evasion mentality. I have to say that the performance of the Greek people during the imposed austerity period we witnessed 6 consecutive years of recession, and their heroic resilience must be commended on the one hand. I think that no other nation could have done more. And it is remarkable that in June 2012, in a vote, the majority voted in favor of their staying in the Eurozone. Of course, people take responsibility for the past. There is no doubt about it. Now, for observation. The Eurozone seems to have a very good austerity strategy, but no significant growth strategy yet. And you know that without the growth strategy, the recession makes austerity and reform self-defeating. Accordingly, there is a risk for a social and political backlash. And this applies to Greece primarily. You know that there is a very important development, the Compact for Growth and Jobs, which was adopted in June 2012. Its philosophy is to bring a European effort for growth and jobs. But so far, it has not managed to be an adequate remedy for the ailing South, as well as another initiative which we call the Youth Guarantee, which gives the opportunity to younger people to have the opportunity to have an internship and to find employment. Fifth observation, Euroscepticism. Eurosceptic feelings have grown, and we cannot fight the fact that this tendency has become stronger and wider, especially in the countries of the south of Europe. This development may characterize to a certain degree the upcoming European Parliament elections next May, and makes extremely timely the discussion on the European architecture and future strategies for Europe. Sixth observation. If I may summarize the feelings of the majority of Greeks, I can say that they believe in the European ideals of democracy, prosperity and equality. If you take out any of these three components, the European idea suffers tremendously. Last but not least, let me quote the Greek foreign minister when he spoke about the future of the European architecture. And I think that his thoughts are very relevant. What he said is the following. After 6 years of crisis, with many member states in recession, suffering high unemployment, the great political question which faces the Union is the deconstruction of the classical historical narrative of Europe. This narrative was for decades based on the linear evolution of history, from good to better, to prosperity, higher standards of living, to the guarantees of the European social state, democracy, culture, quality, competitiveness. What we face today is new forms and new waves of Euroscepticism in almost all member states. Therefore, we need to present to our societies a new agenda, a new narrative that is realistic, specific, and above all, appealing. As a consequence, the biggest problem which faces the EU and the European integration is not institutional, but is political. I would say more values-based and intellectual. It relates to the way in which we think about these issues. There is, of course, an institutional dimension, a dimension which does not concern details. It rather lies in the fact that there are two institutional levels, two institutional domains. One is described by the Lisbon Treaty, the enhanced competence of the European Parliament, the role of the European Commission, the role of the European Council. And there is a real one of the Eurozone, the Eurogroup, the European Council of the fast, high-pressure intergovernmental decisions aimed at confronting the crisis. Now, this leads to major institutional distortions. With the imposition of the intergovernmental method, the role of the European Commission is reduced. the IMF has been brought into the epicenter of European life in a manner which is comparable to NATO presence in Europe on issues of security and defense. But the most important thing is, and please highlight this paragraph, the most important thing is that it voids the basic notion of the institutional equality of member states, a notion on which European integration is founded. There are now two blatant inequalities. There are governments that decide and governments that are obliged to carry out orders to save their own countries. There are member states that belong to the periphery of prodigal countries. There are lenders and borrowers. There are lenders and borrowers. He said it in one word. There are those who answer to their parliaments and their peoples, but in the end feel that they have the capacity to decide for other member states as well. So the matter needs to be raised deeply in the debate, and we have to find solutions that respond to the major practical problems of the days. We need to see how we can increase the competitiveness of our enterprises, particularly small, medium enterprises. We have to see the different prices of energy all over Europe. And what we need to do is to speak in political terms. So, the way forward for the Union at the crossroads, because of the impact of the global financial crisis, calls for an activism, both by the new European Commission and the new European Parliament after the elections of May 2014, in favor of measures which will foster growth, alleviate the burden of austerity programs, and prevent imbalances in terms of trade and competitiveness among members of the Eurozone. The Greek economic crisis, without any doubt, revealed national and systemic weaknesses. As a crisis, she has raised ethical and political questions, both as well as the ordeal suffered by the Greek people, enable us to draw useful conclusions about the future. In a realistic way, the European solidarity brought fruits, and the necessary firewall mechanisms were established. Austerity was implemented. Fiscal consolidation was strengthened. But in the end, too much austerity exacerbates recession. A growth strategy, accompanied by debt relief measures, can be the remedy for the future, without any risk of moral hazard, because the lessons have been learned by the Greeks and conclusions are drawn. I will finish by mentioning an interesting quote by Bernard-Henri Lévy, a French eminent intellectual. He was in Athens in November 2012, and he just said, "For what is Europe basically?" And he replied, "It is an idea before it is a market." More precisely, it is only a market because it is, first of all, an idea. And it is this idea, and not of the three threads of the mind of Rome, of Jerusalem, and of Athens. If one of these threads is cut, it is the soul of Europe that will be lost. If we should come to lack one of these three elements, Europe as a civilization and a culture will collapse. Thank you for the attention. And for me, what is the most interesting part is to be able to receive your questions and continue our discussion. Thank you.